Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And today, I want to break new ground on this channel and talk about video games. And yes, I'm aware of the risk that carries. I've been browsing YouTube long enough to know the hazards of talking about video games. Of all the topics that attract trolls and toxic personalities, video games are notorious for raising the bar. Between the divisive politics, the toxic comment sections, and the personal feuds, it can get very ugly very fast. And certain people with certain ideological affiliations are worse offenders than others. I won't name names, but just mentioning video games on YouTube is enough to get the reference. And I'm still willing to take that risk, because I love video games too. And I want to celebrate the positive impacts they've had on my life. And while I don't consider myself a hardcore gamer, I still grew up playing video games. I vividly recall the first time I played Super Mario Bros. On the NES, and it was a hell of an experience. I might have just been a kid at the time, but I knew it was just the beginning of something amazing. And in the years that followed, I played a wide range of games. I enjoyed many of the classics, including Super Mario Bros., Mega Man, Zelda, Metroid, Star Fox, GoldenEye, Street Fighter, and Madden. Some of my fondest memories involve getting together with my friends, crowding into a cramped basement, and playing video games for hours on end. Most of the time, even in my teen years, it was just pure fun. We didn't play games for the story, the graphics, or the politics. The only thing we cared about was that the games were fun to play. I wish that weren't such a radical concept these days, but I digress. My point is that video games were a toy in my mind. I didn't play them with the intention of having an emotional experience with an amazing story. That's what movies and TV shows were for. At least that was my mentality before I played a very special game called Final Fantasy X. That game, more than any other, forever changed how I saw video games. It also affected me in a way that still resonates to this day. To appreciate how this game impacted me, I need to provide a little background. Most people who have been playing video games for any extended period of time have heard of the Final Fantasy series. It's been around since the late 1980s. Final Fantasy X was just the 10th entry of the franchise. And unlike other franchises, Final Fantasy doesn't build its brand around one or several iconic characters. It's a role-playing game derived from the likes of Dungeons & Dragons. You have all these diverse, colorful characters living in a world of mystical beasts surrounded by magic, wizards, and battles on an immense scale. The characters in one Final Fantasy game differ considerably from those in other installments. A few select creatures like chocobos are the only recurring characters. But each game has a similar setup in terms of story and gameplay. You play as and follow along a team of unique characters, each with certain talents and traits. Some use magic, some use weapons, all of them dressed in an elaborate, distinct way. In addition, the Final Fantasy games often emphasize the story more than most. The plots are rarely as simple as rescuing a princess from a castle. There's often a lot more going on. There's mystery, tension, drama, treachery, and romantic subplots galore. Now, not all of them are equally well done, but the emphasis on story is clear in each game. Final Fantasy X checks all those boxes. It maximizes the mechanics and structure of RPGs to the utmost, and it builds this large, epic story around it. It's certainly not the first Final Fantasy game to take that approach. Final Fantasy VII for the first PlayStation did that, and many cite that game as the high point for the franchise. Now, I respect that opinion, but for me, Final Fantasy X's story will always resonate more. I admit I didn't buy the game for its story. This was the early 2000s. I had only just recently started playing RPG games. I remember just wanting a game I could lose myself in over the summer, if only to stave off boredom. I ended up buying this game because it was on sale at the time and I didn't have enough money for something pricier. But in the end, I got far more than I paid for it in the best possible way. True to its fanciful legacy, Final Fantasy X is set in a strange world full of colorful characters. You start off with Tidus, a star athlete in the futuristic city of Zanarkand. If you're at all familiar with Japanese anime and male protagonists, you'll appreciate his personality. And even if you aren't, he's still uniquely endearing, even if he is immature and hampered by his daddy issues. Tidus is living a good life at the beginning of the story. But all that changes when a huge, monstrous creature named Sin attacks in the middle of a blitzball game. It leads to Tidus being transported along with his friend Auron 1,000 years into the future. From there, he makes new connections and forges new friendships with Wakka, Lulu, Yuna, and Riku. And together, they go on this big, ambitious journey to defeat Sin. Now, that's a very basic rundown of the premise of Final Fantasy X. There's so much more in terms of depth, dynamics, and yes, even politics. It's simply too much for me to cover in one video. Just playing through the game the first time took me over 60 hours. It really is that big, even by PlayStation 2 standards. But this game, and the world it's built around, is so ripe with emotional depth. Beyond their personalities, the characters in Final Fantasy X go through quite a few upheavals, more so than any other game I'd played to that point. In fact, the prologue of the game is actually very solemn. You have Tidus, Yuna, Lulu, Riku, and Wakka all sitting around a campfire, looking so dazed and overwhelmed. And before the action even starts, Tidus has this voiceover that acts as narration for much of the game. He asks you, the player, to listen to his story. You don't know at first just how grand that story is, but the stage is set for something big and dramatic. That was revealing to me. It showed me early on that these weren't generic cartoon characters. These were well-rounded individuals, wrought with feelings, uncertainties, and reservations. You don't know how they got there. To figure out, you had to play the game. You had to experience this exotic world. And that helped give players a personal stake in that story. And to me, that made a big difference that I came to appreciate even more as I played. When it comes to experiencing a story, video games are unique in many respects. Unlike movies, TV shows, and books, you play an active role in that story. You don't just sit back, watch, and take it all in. You become part of the story by playing as the character. While that can complicate the story, especially when you're not very good at the game, it does change the experience. In terms of gameplay, Final Fantasy X is more complicated than most, even by RPG standards. It utilizes a conditional turn-based battle system, not unlike Pokemon, but with more characters in play. You also gain skills and experience based on combat. The more you play, the more experience points you get. With it, you can learn and upgrade skills using the Sphere Grid, choosing from a wide variety of skills along the way. If it sounds complicated, that's because it is. I freely admit it took me quite a while to get the hang of it. I got stuck on more than one area because I didn't build my characters right. It was a real grind at times, and more than a little frustrating, especially in the days before YouTube walkthroughs. But it also made the game a lot more engaging. It's not as simple as go here, collect points, and repeat. There's an element of strategy involved. You have to be patient and diligent, building up your characters in just the right way so that you're ready to take on the bigger challenges that come along. It does mean the story gets dragged out, because in order to move forward, you have to grind through a great many battles. It can be tedious, but it gives new dimensions to the story. If you want to see how it plays out, you have to put in the work. You have to earn it. You can't just turn a page or fast forward. You have to go through these struggles with these characters. It may sound like a messy way to consume a story, but it also gives weight to every obstacle you overcome in the game. When you defeat a powerful boss, be it Sinspawn, Maester Seymour, or Rogue Machina, you share in the accomplishment with the characters. You can't just sleep through certain parts, you have to remain engaged. On top of that, the gameplay in Final Fantasy X is not linear. It does start out with you just going from one place to another, but at a certain point, you gain the ability to travel and explore the world of Spira. From its dazzling cities to its most secret areas, you can experience everything on your own terms. Plenty of other games do that, Zelda being the most notable, but by playing through the game at your own pace, navigating its many challenges, experiencing plot twists and revelations along the way, Final Fantasy X sets players up for a major payoff in the long run. And this is where the overall gaming experience for me gained a whole new dimension. To some extent, Final Fantasy X told just the right story for that particular era of gaming. Coming out on the PlayStation 2, it could render quality graphics and accommodate professional voice acting. While the first PlayStation had many games with great voice acting, the graphics did have some limitations. It was somewhat hard to glean much emotion from the blocky images of Lara Croft or Solid Snake. Final Fantasy X really maximized the PlayStation 2's hardware. It was actually the first Final Fantasy game to be fully voice acted from start to finish. Final Fantasy VII might get more credit for its story, but let's face it, there's only so much you can feel by reading blocks of text. Hearing these characters speak, seeing them interact and talk in their own quirky ways, some more so than others, it gives a sense of what they're feeling. Characters like Lulu and Riku have such distinct tones for their voices, tones that you'd never get just by reading a block of text. It conveys both personality and emotion. But it was the emotions within the voiceovers that really struck me. Being able to see the expression and hear the tones of Yuna and Tidus, I felt the true impact of the game's biggest moments. From the revelations about Tidus' father to the truth behind Yuna's pilgrimage, it really resonated with me. And by guiding these characters through those moments as I played the game, I felt actively engaged. It paid off even more as the romantic subplot between Yuna and Tidus unfolded. While it wasn't the most refined romance, there were some laughably awkward moments along the way, it still felt sincere. When one character shed a tear, I believed in the sentiments behind it. I've always been a romance fan. From comic books to movies, I make no apologies for my love of romantic subplots. But Final Fantasy X is the first time a romance in a video game really genuinely touched my heart. There are several scenes where the love between Yuna and Tidus really shows. It never feels cheesy, forced, or contrived. By going through what they went through together, you really buy into the idea that these two have fallen in love. It ultimately plays out in these dazzling, heartfelt expressions of emotion, accompanied perfectly by wonderful music by Nobuo Uematsu. That romantic subplot, and the way it deepens the story as well as the overall impact, plays a huge role in how this game ends. And it's here where the experience really hit me hard, but in the best possible way. Getting to the end of Final Fantasy X was both challenging and arduous. As I noted earlier, this game is a real grind, as many RPGs tend to be. However, this epic story does have a final boss battle, a final culmination for this amazingly epic narrative. Defeating the boss in any game is the ultimate goal, but for me, it was only a precursor to the game's apex moment. The final boss battle has many elements. Even if you've built your team right through the sphere grid, it's still quite challenging. And when you finally succeed, it's a hell of an achievement. It's also a relief in many ways. That's what I felt at first when I finally defeated that boss named Yu Yevon. But the cutscene that played out afterwards changed it into something so much more. It started off with plenty of drama, seeing Arn finally leave for the far plane. But then, we see Tidus looking down at his hands, knowing he's about to disappear. He warned his friends before the final fight. He joined that fight knowing that winning may mean his death. It's a powerful moment, one made so much stronger when Yuna tries to embrace him, not wanting to see him go. And when she runs towards him, passing right through him in the process, you know it's too late. When I first saw that, my heart skipped a beat. Then, when Yuna says she loves him and he embraces her one last time, it skipped several. This beautiful moment, the end of Tidus' story, this journey I'd been part of as a player, hit me so hard. The heartbreak Yuna felt, Tidus' solemn acceptance of his fate, it was profound. I wish there were more words to describe what I felt when I first experienced it. I distinctly remember my lips quivering and my mouth hanging open as I saw it. I also remember just staring at my TV in stunned awe, a lump in my throat and a tear in my eye. And yet, I was smiling, because I knew I'd just experienced something special. Then, if that weren't hard enough, Yuna's final words before the credits really hammered it home. The people and friends that we've lost, or the dreams that have faded, never forget them. Rest assured, Yuna, I haven't forgotten. No matter how many video games I play for the rest of my life, I will never forget. To this day, it's hard to overstate what I felt after playing Final Fantasy X. It wasn't just the first time I felt a real emotional impact from playing a video game. It was one of the most intense impacts I felt from any story in any medium. We all have certain stories that touch us on a personal level. Be they real or fantasy, they affect us in ways we just can't put into words. That's what makes them so meaningful. Final Fantasy X, a video game I purchased on a whim, not knowing the breadth and grandeur of its story, became one of those stories for me. It demonstrated how a video game could create an intense narrative experience, one you feel on multiple levels. It opened me up to the idea that a video game could tell a story on this scale. As a result, I've sought games that seek to tell that kind of story. Many have given me a similar experience. Games like Mass Effect, Metal Gear Solid, Heavy Rain, and Uncharted, they all struck me with the emotional weight of their story. But Final Fantasy X will always be special for being the first. It set the bar, and it set a damn high bar too. For that, I'll always be grateful to its creators and Square Enix. It created for me a uniquely emotional experience, one that still resonates with me to this day. The world it explored may be fantasy, but the feelings it evoked are so very, very real. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Take care and stay safe.